So you have a list of demands, some of which, the most obvious, and those which had to be conceded, have been conceded by the military. The rest, the military are not likely to concede unless the movement carries on, and unless the movement is able to continue to exerting pressure on them. And that's here where we get to what it would take. The point is the jubilation that met the announcement that Mubarak was leaving the scene and transmitting power is perfectly understandable for people who have been engaged in such a protracted struggle and with all the sacrifices and all that. Is absolutely great. And having the movement at the end focusing on the demand that he leaves the scene, and he himself getting very stubborn about that, and actually stupid in a sense from the point of view of the interests of the institutions that he represents, because this only got the movement more and more radical. In this radicalization, we have seen not only the movement gathering momentum as a movement, as demonstrations and all that, but we have also seen over the very last few days the beginning of a strike of waves, a wave of strikes, of working class strikes, and even other sectors. And today this has spread, despite the fact that the movement, yes, I mean, when Mubarak left the scene the day before yesterday, was rejoicing, and parts of it were saying that's the end of the uprising. Even today, we have seen an expansion of these waves into even some police forces in some cities went on strike. So there is a kind of continuation of a strike movement, which is probably, I mean, not probably, certainly one of the most important dimension of what is happening. And I would say that if this is able, if ever this is able to expand, if the situations created now can really lead to the expansion of the creation of a new and independent union movement, workers' unions in the country for the first time in several decades, then we would have there a major change, creating the conditions for future waves of struggle, which could go much further than this one has gone. But this also is a key condition. This, combined with the ability for the movement to pass successfully the test next Friday, this would be what could enable the movement to really go beyond the army-controlled transition, the orderly transition that Washington and other Western countries has been calling for in Egypt. Of course, we are not for chaotic transitions anyway, but we are speaking of different orders here. When they say orderly transition, it's just a code name for a transition controlled by the military. And that's what is going on. That's what Washington wanted. That's what is now going on there in the country. And by the way, one of the things the military proclaimed, aside from some demagogic statements, they thanked Mubarak, and they also stated that they will stick to the all international treaties and obligations of Egypt, and that includes, of course, the Egyptian-Israeli kind of relations, and of course the Egyptian-American relation. Now, very quickly in very few words about the regional dimension. As you know, this wave, the shock wave, started in Tunisia, affected already a lot of countries in the region. Algeria, Jordan, Yemen, even Sudan, all these countries have seen demonstrations and well, there is a real possibility for movements unfolding in these countries, even though the recent attempt in Algeria was not very successful because of very heavy repressive measures taken against it. But still, the Egyptian second toppling of a dictator coming after Tunisia will certainly embolden the protest movement across the region. In Yemen, the movement has already reached a large scale, and it is continuing on. The dictator there has already made a lot of concessions, and the movement is therefore encouraged to push for more. Where conditions exist for objectively for the explosion, but this shockwave is not likely to lead to similar results, at least in the foreseeable future, except if, I don't know, some big surprise happens. That would be surprising, is in those countries where the political regimes are quite more repressive than whatever you had in Egypt. And that's the case of Syria, where the space for any political opposition is non-existent. I mean, in Egypt you had a large, actually, opposition movement, including the Muslim Brotherhood, a very big organization, which had a semi-legal existence. There is nothing of the kind in a country like Syria, in a country like Libya, where dictatorships are much more ferocious, and therefore it would take, let's say, much more for people to dare to come forward in facing the regime. But this can't be excluded, of course. And if it happens, it might there be much bloodier than what we have seen in Tunisia and in Egypt. And the same goes for different reasons in Iran. But Iran, as you know, is a country where protest movement already happened after the last elections in 2009, and that was quelled brutally, but by a regime which has, contrarily to Tunisia and Egypt, its own social constituency, and that's a major difference. That is, if you compare Iran, the Iranian regime is able to mobilize a mass force. Neither the Tunisian dictatorship nor the Egyptian one were able to do that. When the Egyptians tried to organize pro-Mubarak demonstrations, they were just thugs. I mean, nobody was fooled by the reality of these pro-Mubarak demonstrations. So in Iran, the regime has this further strength, which doesn't exist in the two other countries, and is ferocious as the most repressive regimes in the region, and as we are seeing now, it has increased the rate of capital, the executions in the country. Since the beginning of the year, there's been some 100 executions in the country, and that's a way of terrorizing the would-be protesters, all the more that these executions included, although on the face of it, most of them were about drugs and drug traffics, but they included several protesters, several people who were part of the protest movement. So the limitation for the shockwave is rather the repressive character of the regimes, and the fact is that the two countries where these happen are not the most repressive in the area. They are more repressive than them, and in those countries, the situation will be, as I said, more difficult. But again, this whole uprising is really changing completely the atmosphere in the whole Middle East. It is ushering in a new historical era. I think this is the beginning of a new political phase, if you want, in the political history of the region. After decades of a combination of autocratic governments and stifling political freedoms, and especially the left, and where the dominant forces in the mass opposition were of a religious fundamentalist character, we are seeing changes and the eruption of a democratic movement led by young people, which is not religious in its programmatic dimension, and which creates really absolutely new conditions and favorable conditions for the rebuilding and re-emergence of progressive opposition in all these countries, and a left-wing movement, and even a working class movement which has been absent from the scene politically, not socially, but politically for more than half a century. So this is really creating a great measure of hope, and well, will be all of us looking at the developments with great interest. Thank you very much. On the role of women, yes, indeed, it's an important, very important dimension of what happens. Now, it's not new that women are playing important role in the structured oppositions or the pre-existing oppositions in both countries. If you take Tunisia and Egypt, there are a lot of young women were involved in the protest over the years, the democratic protest at the very least, not to mention the social protest where you had women workers and men and women involved. So you had an involvement of women. Now, yes, I mean the participation of women in the demonstrations was quite remarkable, and it built up in a country like Egypt after the first days, when it became clear that that would be non-violent, if you want. And that actually shows how non-violence as a form of protest is more likely to attract women than other forms of protest. We have in the region already an experience of that, the major difference between the first Intifada in Palestine and the second Intifada. In the first Intifada, the role of women was quite prominent in the first Intifada in the late 80s, whereas in the second Intifada, you hardly saw any women taking part in what happened. And there is more to be said, in the sense that although, as I said, I mean, well, this is peculiar to Egypt, to having prayers in the demonstrations, whether Muslim or Christian prayers. They had on Friday Muslim prayers and on Sunday Christian prayers. But here again, despite that, which for an impressionistic observer would fit into the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood are going to take over, actually, I was talking to friends in Cairo, and they said, for the first time we are seeing women smoking in the demonstration. You wouldn't have seen women smoking in the street in Cairo before that.
Considered a form of liberation.
Never. So that's completely new, and that shows how people impose spaces of freedom and all that in such conditions of mobilization. The April 6 movement is a movement of young people who, as I said, they started by trying to organize a general strike or calling for a day of general action and protest in 2008 in solidarity with one of the important strikes that was going on at that time. Now the day they called for failed, but they remained as a movement, organizing protest, one source of organized protest. And in such, I mean, they are coalitions of young people from various political backgrounds. Before that, you had the Kifaya movement, which was born in the first as a solidarity with the in 2000 the 2002 Intifada, and they started around that and then carried on. So these are, let's say, they are not political parties. They are rather movements of a broad character involving people from various political opinions, but having in common this goal of the fight for democracy, and in the case of the April 6th movement also some at least progressive social perspective, since it started in solidarity with worker strikes. In Tunisia, the military is relatively quite less important than what it is in Egypt. It wasn't the backbone of power, although Ben Ali himself originates in the army, but he moved to the security forces and then become Minister of Interior and then Prime Minister, and then took over pushing aside the president of the time, Bourguiba. And he built his regime as a police regime. It was not built on the army, but rather on the security forces and his elite security forces. And himself and his family imposed themselves even on local capitalism as a real mafia, racketeering even local capitalism in a sense. So for local capitalists, that was a more or less acceptable price to pay, as long as he ensured stability and conditions, including implementation of neoliberal programs that helped them make money. But when they saw recently that he turned into a liability, they got rid of him. Now in Egypt, the army is a much bigger, plays a much bigger role in the regime, in the country, even in the economy. It's a huge institution. It has its own economic enterprises, from tourism to any kind of things. It has, so it's very tentaculous, and it is funded by the United States to the tune of $1 billion, $200 million per year. So this institution, which is trained, funded, and armed, and we could see American weapons even in the streets of Cairo, these Abrams tanks, for instance, is and has been the key institution of power in the country for ever since you had the military coup in 1952 and the beginning of military dictatorship, with a major difference that the nature of the army changed over the years, especially after Nasser, when the regime turned to economic liberalization, denasserization, the dismantlement of whatever progressive social reforms had been implemented during the Nasser years. And you had this kind of combination of the army with the crony capitalism that developed in Egypt since started developing since the 70s. And we, as I said, we could see this mixture at all levels of the regime. So this is really a regime of the rule of the army and crony capitalism. And this combination of army and crony capitalism is still in power, no doubt about that. So it's less, until now at least, the change, qualitatively speaking, in Egypt is less than what we had, although even in Tunisia it has its limitations. But there's more of a continuity in the kind of institution that is governing in Egypt. Now, what they will, where change will happen, unless, of course, we have more due to the mass resumption or the continuation of the mass movement, as I said. But I mean, for what is planned by the military themselves and Washington behind them, is the so-called orderly transition, is a scenario by which the army would keep in control, create a real space for democratic elections and things of the kind, although under control. And yes, I mean, we will see certainly the army trying to co-opt political forces. As I mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood are very likely forced to be co-opted. I mean, they actually are saying we are not going to put forward a presidential candidate, which would be actually a challenge to the, a way, which would have been a way for them to say we are seeking power. So they say not at this stage, yeah. And they are praising the army for time being. So and Washington, actually, you hear also U.S. source, those who were saying we have to do business with these guys, they are not. Don't confuse them with Al-Qaeda, and indeed, they are quite different type of organization. So they are not radicals. We can do business with them. This is what they will probably try to be doing in order to isolate the radical wing of the movement and contain it, therefore, and be able to dismiss it. By the way, I mean, if you think of the reason why the United States funds the Egyptian army, one key reason of that is the fact that this army is part of the proxy forces for Washington in protecting the oil interest of Washington in the area. And the key oil interest of Washington in the area is, I mean, the most important one is the Saudi kingdom. And if you have an uprising in the Saudi kingdom, the repetition of what they did when they sent French forces and tried to disguise them as Muslims and things like that, they took some measures in that regard. They had to convert to Islam to be able to enter Mecca and quell the movement. If you have something on a more massive scale, they won't be able to send American troops or French troops, and not to mention Israeli troops. And that's where you need something like the Egyptian army, which would be able to intervene without religion issues involved. So yeah, that's because what would be at stake would be much higher than anything we have seen until now. You know, Washington is definitely not worried by the religious dimension of the Muslim Brotherhood. Were they worried by that, I mean, their closest ally in the region would not be the Saudi kingdom, which is the most fundamentalist state, not only in the region, I mean, of all on earth. I mean, it's an extremely fundamentalist, Islamic fundamentalist state, the most anti-democratic, most anti-women, and all that. And this is the best friend of Washington, and the most important piece of real estate for Washington in the whole region. So, no, the real point is to make sure that these guys, you know, can do business with Washington. They can enter this kind of frame. And that's what they will be trying to control. So, but the army will look forward to that while keeping in control of the situation. I'm sure that in Washington, this kind of scenario is the one that they see the best one. So in order to get to something that looks democratic, but that could be remain in the West. Even if you look at the present Turkish government, despite all the gestures by the Turkish Prime Minister, Turkey is still a firm member of NATO. It's still, still part of the U.S. System in the region, and they didn't go very far in breaking with that. They made some gesture, partly in order for domestic reasons, in order to cater for their kind of constituency. Speaking of the Islamic movement, is there any prospect of Islamic radicalization of what we are seeing? Well, I ended, yes, by saying that I think that what happened it ushers in a change, an epochal change for the region. And the key reason is that precisely the dominant force in what we have seen has not been the fundamentalist forces or religious forces. And, well, that's the case clearly in Tunisia, but also in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood was not supporting the movement when it began. It joined the movement in the third day after they made sure that, or they could see that it really was a very big movement. So they had to join anyway. When the military, when Omar Sleiman offered to negotiate with the opposition, they accepted and discredited them. They were very much attacked because of that, because of accepting to negotiate with the Mubarak regime. And they had embarrassed attempts at explaining why they did so when they saw that the movement was continuing to develop. So they don't come out of this whole event stronger. Now, the fact that they will have more freedom to act will enable them to better build themselves, but in a politically weakened situation. Because one of their strengths is, and that's the point, is that, and that's a point that applies to the whole religious forces in the region, is that they appeared as the staunchest enemies of the existing order. Now, when they appear as having been, superseded by other forces, this aspect, is no longer there as it used to be, and therefore, that's why I said I think this movement can open the way for new left forces, for a new progressive movement, a new working class movement in the region to build up. And the conditions are there. We have seen, if you take a country like Egypt, now since 2006, a social working class radicalization, to be more accurate, it's not even social in general terms, it's even a working class radicalization, in which, again, here the Muslim Brotherhood did not play any leading role at all. Actually, programmatically, they can be more on the side of the bosses than on the side of the workers, as also in the also more on the side of landowners in the countryside than on the side of poor peasants. So this social radicalization, combined with the democratic character of what we've seen, and the fact that, contrary to Iran 79, they are not in the leadership of that, as Khomeini managed to put himself in Iran, I think this might have ultimately the same role for the region than the Iranian 79 revolution had. The Iranian revolution of 79 opened this era of dominance of the Islamic fundamentalist forces in the opposition movements in the whole region. Maybe what I'm saying is wishful thinking, but I think there are grounds to hope that this 2011 revolution or uprising or whatever you want to call it will open a new cycle, a new political cycle in the region. And indeed, in the coming elections in both Tunisia and Egypt, there will be left-wing forces, definitely. There is a coalition of radical left forces in Tunisia, and there are left-wing, radical left forces in Egypt. This is a country where the best possible scenario would be the emergence of a trade union, independent union movement, and on the basis of the union movement, a labor party based on the unions. That would be the best kind of scenario for Egypt, and it's a country where this is not a complete fantasy, because it's a country with a really strong, concentrated, large working class, industrial working class, and this is, if there is any country in the whole region where this is possible, it is definitely Egypt as a possible kind of scenario. This time, that won't be a movement from above, but a movement from below. And that's a key difference. And that's also, I would say, in the form of organization that we've seen, this network dimension and all that, and that's how it's functioning. International solidarity nowadays, it goes through YouTube, Facebook, etc. And that's also part of the picture. Thank you.